How we doing, family? Hold on. Let's establish some ground rules for today. It's very important. Okay, first of all, we are not talking football today. We're not. Listen, we're not, okay? Had a church member come up to me a while ago, come on my way in. He said, hey, Pastor, what would you think about the games yesterday? I said, get behind me, Satan. You have in mind the things of man, not of God, right? Hey, this is the good news about the gospel is, listen, we live in a world where lots of things will disappoint you, but Jesus never will, right? So you've gathered in the right place, Georgia fans, to nurse your wounds. Let's open up to Luke chapter 14. If you have a Bible, hey, real quickly, for those of you who are guests, you're a guest maybe for the first time or second time today, I just want to let you know we're thrilled to have you. We're really excited that you're here. I want to encourage you, if you're looking for a church home, this is a great time to actually connect in Emmaus Church. A lot of stuff happening right now at the Christmas season, but really beginning of January, a lot of stuff launching. And so Pastor Brian's going to be up here later talking about our Institute classes that are coming up, and we're really excited about those. So if you're looking for a new church home, we'd love to have you. Now is a great time to connect. And then our small groups are going to be launching again in February, beginning of February. So lots of cool things happening. I also want to say this for the newbies in here. For those of you who don't know, we would love for you to stop by the welcome desk out front, outside to the left with the blue E on the front of it. We'd love to put a gift in your hand that includes a Crossway Luke journal where you can actually track with our series and keep coming back and taking notes as we're preaching verse by verse through the Gospel of Luke. And also if at some point you need access to our mother baby room, we have that out there. It's beautiful, hospitable. It's got the sermon in there, just comfortable place for you to go if you need it. And then as always, our kids ministry is incredible if you never checked that out. All that being said, Luke chapter 14, we're starting a brand new chapter. That's rare around here. So starting a brand new one today, Luke 14, beginning in verse 1. And I'll start it off like this. I mean, I love the fact it's the Christmas season and everything about the Christmas vibe and what happens around Christmas, I just really dig. And so this past Monday evening, I was at the house with my family, and it happened to be pretty cold outside, right? And so I had a fire. I built a fire in the fireplace, and that thing was going. It was real cozy in there. It had the Christmas tree was all lit up and beautiful, and was sipping on a cup of chamomile tea, a little splash of cream, and I'm sitting in my chair reading a book, reading a novel. I've been working my way through. The point is, it was like a perfect night. It's like a Norman Rockwell painting, man. It was just one of those perfect evenings. It was an incredible night until it wasn't. And so here's what happened. So I'm reading my novel, sipping my tea, Christmas trees lit up, and then at some point, our youngest daughter, Madeline, screams downstairs to my wife and I, telling us that she's going to bed. She's going to bed. She wants us to come say goodnight. She's going to bed. And so my wife gets up off the couch and she starts to walk upstairs. And as she's walking upstairs, she looks at me. She goes, "Hey, are you going to come tell Madeline goodnight?" And it was just at a really good point in the book. And so I looked at my wife and I said, "Yeah, I'll be there in just a second, but this is crazy what's happening. I just need to finish these 2 paragraphs. I'll be right up." And so my wife kept walking up. So I finished these paragraphs. I got to a good stopping place. And so I put the book down, and then I start to walk upstairs. I go to my daughter's room to tell her goodnight. Again, everything's perfect at this point. But here's where it started to go sideways. I walk in my youngest daughter's room, walk over to the bed to tell her goodnight. What I did not know is that my oldest daughter, Annabelle, was hiding in her closet, because collectively they had decided that one wonderful way to show me that they love me is for Annabelle to jump out of the closet and give me a heart attack, right? You feel the love. And so I was aware of this. Now here's the deal. Before you judge my children and go, "Well, that's just awful. That's not honoring your parents. How rude of those McMahon girls." Listen, before you start to judge them, you need to understand something about our home. We actually do this all the time. in our house. It's just a thing. Like scaring each other in our house is a love language. It's just something we've done for years, right? And so we just kind of find it to be fun. Like for example, one year, my mom for Christmas gave us an antique doll, like a little antique doll. Now here's the deal. I don't know why we didn't ask for an antique doll. It's not something on the list that we gave her. She just decided, hey, I'm in an antique shop. There's a creepy doll. I'm sure my son would want it, right? She bought us this doll, and the problem with this doll is that it looks exactly like the kind of creepy, terrifying doll that you would see in a horror movie that would come to life at night and chase you around the house, right? And so it's terrifying. So at some point, we gave the doll a name, and we called the doll Freaky Frank. And because I love my daughters with all my heart, every now and then when they're least expecting it, I will take Freaky Frank and I will hide him behind a pillow in their bed. And I will patiently wait for the scream. It's for the kids. They love it, right? So the point is, this is something that typically happens around our house all the time. Like we do, this is what we do. We eat dinner every night together at the dinner table as a family, and we pray together every week as a family, and we terrify one another to the glory of God, right? It's just who we are. And normally it's not a big deal. Normally it's no problem. But here's what made this time different. What my daughters weren't aware of is that when I was downstairs, the book that I had been reading was by an author from the 40s and 50s named Shirley Jackson, and the name of the book was The Haunting of Hill House. It's about a group of people staying in a house where lots of creepy and terrifying things are happening. So I'm already on edge, right? I'm already a little bit uptight and get the heebie-jeebies a little bit, right? And so I come in there to tell my daughter good night, and as I walk to her door or walk to her bed, I hear the closet. I hear something happen at the closet, a little noise. So my eyes slowly drift over to the closet, and then for a split second, I thought I saw the knob slowly turning. This is when my heart starts to, what's going on, right? And so I'm getting kind of nervous. And then it was at this moment when my oldest daughter, Annabelle, swung the door open as fast as she could and screamed, "What are you doing, old man?" Let me ask you a question, family. How many of you have ever heard a grown man scream? Anybody? Okay, well, how many of you have ever heard a grown man scream for like 5 seconds straight? Because I'm just, like, that was me. I'm not even kidding. That was me. I screamed like a Swiftie at the top of my lungs, man. Terrified. And my daughter's just smiling and filled with glee and joy, and she looks at me and she just says, "Gotcha." And this is the love that fills our family. Now here's why I tell you that story, family. Just so you know, this is what brings us to Luke chapter 14, because here's what we're about to see. When we get to Luke chapter 14, we're introduced to this group of people who have basically made it their life's mission to lure Jesus into a trap so that they can get him. That's their aim. That's their objective. Here's what I mean. So we've been, again, if you've been here for a while, you know that we've been, as a church family here at Emmaus, we've been walking through the Gospel of Luke now for well over a year. And what's been fascinating to see, if you've been paying attention, is that over and over and over again, one of the things that we've discovered is that even though Jesus, the Son of God, right, God with skin on, even though Jesus has come into human history and he's preaching truth and he's teaching incredible lessons and parables and he's showing people what God is like and what God desires, and even though he's doing all kinds of crazy, amazing, fantastic miracles, not everybody's really excited about the fact that Jesus is here, right? Not everybody's fired up about what Jesus is teaching and what Jesus is preaching and what Jesus is doing. Not everybody's really pleased with it. Matter of fact, by far, the most popular group of people who were just total haters when it came to Jesus and his message and what he was doing was a group of people known as the Pharisees. Right? And if you've been paying attention as we were walking through the Gospel of Luke, we talked about the Pharisees often. We've seen cameos. The Pharisees have been popping up their heads over and over and over again. And And for those of you who may not know, the Pharisees were the religious leaders during the day of Jesus. And when you read the Gospels, one of the things you find out, man, is this group of Pharisees, this group of religious leaders, basically, I mean, these guys had a PhD when it came to criticizing Jesus. They're always constantly criticizing Jesus. Let me ask you a question, family, real quickly. How many of y'all would agree that facing criticism, enduring criticism can be absolutely exhausting? Amen, right? I mean, nobody sees criticism as a blessing, right? Nobody enjoys criticism. I don't know about you. I've never woken up in the morning and go, man, I hope my inbox is full of snarky emails, right? I would just really love to be blasted today. Nobody enjoys criticism. Nobody likes it, right? Now think about this for a second. As much as you don't enjoy criticism, as much as criticism is exhausting to you and you don't like facing it, I want you to consider this, beloved. There has been nobody in the history of history less deserving of criticism than Jesus Christ. I mean, all of human history, right? There's been, like, we're talking the perfect, sinless Son of God, full of love and grace and truth and mercy, right? There's been nobody in history less deserving of criticism than Jesus. But family, listen, even though this is true, what we find in the Gospels is that Jesus was constantly enduring criticism. He's all the time, he's being slandered, he's being blasted, he's being criticized by these Pharisees, and we've seen it over and over and over again in the Gospel of Luke. So for example, I'll give you a 30,000-foot flyover real quick of what we've seen in the Gospel of Luke. Like in Luke chapter 5, they accuse Jesus of speaking blasphemy, right? Which essentially means slandering God. That's what they accuse Jesus of. You're slandering God. And then later on in chapter 5, they criticize Jesus for having the gall to eat with sinners and tax collectors. And then in Luke chapter 7, they criticize Jesus for not caring about the Sabbath, which is kind of ironic because Jesus is God, which means he made the Sabbath, right? But they accuse him of not caring about it. And then in Luke chapter 7, they criticize Jesus because he allows a sinful woman to touch his feet. And then in Luke chapter 11, they criticize Jesus for not washing his hands before he eats dinner. And it just keeps going on and on and on and on, right? Here's the point, family. Over and over and over again throughout the Gospel of Luke, all we've seen is that these religious leaders, this group of religious leaders known as the Pharisees, have been blasting and criticizing Jesus, and it's just exhausting. It's just almost like we're almost getting tired of seeing it. We're almost like, okay, great, another sermon where Jesus is getting blasted by a critic, right? And I mean, it's almost like whack-a-mole. How many of y'all are old enough to remember whack-a-mole at the arcade? You remember that dumb game, right? You go into the arcade and you had this big foam hammer, right? You had all these holes in front of you, and then you'd start the game, and out of one of the holes would pop up this little creepy mole with a little sinister smile on his face. He did his little weird evil laugh, like, and you'd hit him as hard as you could with the hammer. But the problem was you'd hit him with the hammer, and then remember what happened? Another one would pop out of another hole, and you'd hit it, but then there were 2, and then there were 5, and then there were 8, right? Listen, this is the perfect metaphor for the Pharisees in the Gospel of Luke. Like up to this point, it's been like Pharisee whack-a-mole, man. Like a guy will come out and he'll criticize Jesus for doing something. Jesus will respond, put the guy in his place, but then we turn the page and there's 2 more, there's 5 more accusing Jesus of doing something that they don't like. Now here's what's so crazy. Now when we get to Luke chapter 14, we've actually gotten to the point, this conflict with the Pharisees, these religious leaders have snowballed to such an extent that now these brothers here in Luke 14 are looking for a way to trap Jesus. They're looking for a way to get Jesus out of their way. They're sick of it. They're tired of the following that Jesus has been gaining. They're tired of what he's been teaching and preaching and doing. They feel threatened by him. And so they're looking for a way to just get Jesus out of their way. Get this, even if it means he has to die. That's where things have brought us in Luke chapter 14. Matter of fact, back in Luke chapter 11, there was this really ominous verse. I think it's one of the most ominous verses in the entire Gospel of Luke. It's found in Luke 11, verse 53, and it said this. Now, if you remember this, it said, as Jesus went away from there, the scribes and the Pharisees began to press him hard and to provoke him to speak about many things, lying in wait for him to catch him in something he might say, right? Okay, so on the count of three, everybody say catch. You ready? 1, 2, 3. Catch. One more time. 1, 2, 3. Here's what's so fascinating about that passage. That word catch is actually the Greek word therivo, and what it literally means is to hunt. That's what it means in the Greek. It means to hunt. So I want you to get the word picture here. What we're being told is that the Pharisees now they're hunting Jesus like he's a wild animal. It says calculated. And how exactly do you hunt a wild animal? You trap it. These guys are on the hunt. And here's the thing, because Jesus is God in the flesh, because Jesus knows everything, right? Jesus is quite aware that this is what's going on in their hearts. Jesus isn't unaware. Jesus isn't like confused about their motivations here. He is quite aware of the fact that these brothers all hate him. He's quite aware of the fact that these guys are trying to trap him. He totally understands that these guys want to kill him. Jesus is aware of all of those things, which is why verse 1 of Luke chapter 14 is so stunning. Consider this. Jesus knows their motivations. He knows their hearts. He knows they're out to get him. He knows they're out to trap him. And then we read this in verse 1, even though Jesus knows all of these things. Watch what it says, family. Luke 14, verse 1 says this. One Sabbath, when he went to dine at the house of a ruler of the who? What? Hold up. I mean, that can't be right? That can't be. Let's double check this thing. Let's fact check this for a second. So went to dine, ruler of the Pharisees, Greek word, Phariseo. Yep, Pharisee. He went to dine. Okay. Of all the places that Jesus could have eaten on that day, on that Sabbath, Jesus goes to dine at the house of a Pharisee who hates him, who's plotting against him, who's blasting him, who lives to criticize him. I mean, why would Jesus eat that? Why would Jesus? Okay, so here's what I want you to do real quick. I want you to imagine that you have someone in your life who constantly criticizes you. Some of you are looking at the person next to you. Don't do that. I'm not trying to cause marriage stuff, okay? I want you to imagine you have someone in your life who just constantly just like lives to criticize you. And listen, here's the deal, real quickly, just for clarity's sake. I'm not talking about fair criticism because here's the thing. Not all criticism is unfair, amen? I mean, let's just admit that. Like, listen, none of us is perfect. All of us have sinned and fallen short of God, which means sometimes, quite frankly, we deserve to be criticized, man, right? Sometimes we deserve it. Like if someone calls me a jerk, sometimes it's not that she's wrong. It could just be that I'm being a jerk, right? Like sometimes if my boss says, you're lazy, it's not that he's being abusive and authoritative, it's that I'm being lazy, right? So here's the thing, not all criticism is unfair. So I'm not talking about unfair criticism or fair criticism. I'm talking about unfair criticism, right? So think about this. Imagine you've got someone in your life who just constantly criticizes you and like makes these little snarky comments. And it's always just like unfair and discouraging, right? It's the person who says to you, hey, how come this friendship's so one-sided? How come you don't reciprocate this whole thing? I feel like this friendship's so one-sided. How come you can't do friendship right? What's your deal, man? And you know what? Speaking of that, have you gained weight? Or is that just an ugly dress? And what'd you do to your hair? Was that on purpose? And you know what's weird? I never noticed you had so many freckles. You have a lot of freckles. Like your whole face is a freckle. Like Freckle Franny. It's crazy. Hey, you know what, let's talk, because how come you never text me back? I feel like I text you and you either never text me back or you only, when you text me, it's like 10 minutes later. And what's going on there? And by the way, speaking of that, you remember that time that you were supposed to pick me up at the airport and you're 15 minutes late? I think about that all the time. All the time. If you were a better friend, you'd probably be on time with a different haircut, because that's hideous, right? It's just like, like imagine you got somebody in your life who's like, all they do is criticize and say snarky stuff, and it's unfair. And then at some point, that same person invites you to go to Chili's with them. You want to go? Think about it this way. Imagine I get to the office, early one Monday morning, and I open up my email, and I got an email in there from somebody in the church, and like, "Dear Pastor Anson, I just feel led to tell you, you stink. Your sermons are too long, they're boring, they're incoherent. I don't even think you preach the gospel. You're a heretic with a capital H. Your best spiritual gift is being a loser. You have bad hair. I don't like your family, and I doubt your salvation. But my wife and I would love to take you out for an enchilada. You in?" How many of y'all think I want to accept that invitation, right? I mean, I'll tell you this, I wouldn't want to. Like, every single thing in my flesh at that moment would want to write an email back that says, "Dear sir, thank you for all the kind, warm words. Unfortunately, I can't do dinner this week because my schedule is very busy, but please ask me again." Never. I mean, like, who wants to go to dinner with Captain Criticism? Who wants to accept an invitation like that, right? And this is what makes what just happened so stunning. Think about this. This is crazy to me, family. Here's Jesus, who never deserved criticism and never deserved slander. He's the perfect, sinless Son of God, and he's constantly being blasted unfairly by these religious leaders. And yet, on a Sabbath day, presumably at some point after the synagogue had let out, the ruler of the Pharisee comes to Jesus and says, "Hey, Jesus, would you like to come over to my home today for some fish and taters?" And stunningly, Jesus says, "Sure, what time?" And he goes. What makes this incredibly, extra stunning to me is when you read the Gospel of Luke, you find that this is actually the third dinner invitation Jesus accepted to the home of a Pharisee. He went to dinner in Luke chapter 7 at the house of a Pharisee. He went to dinner in Luke chapter 11 at the house of a Pharisee, and both of them were train wrecks. And a third time, a Pharisee who hates the guy says, "You want to come?" Jesus says, "Absolutely." Now, incidentally, this actually brings us to the first point we're going to camp out on for a few minutes today, family, and it says, jot this down if you're taking notes. Number one, listen, family. Jesus shows us what it looks like to love our enemies. Jesus Christ shows us what it looks like to love our enemies. He shows us. One of the things we all need to understand is this, okay? Here's the deal. One really important thing that makes Jesus the greatest leader who has ever lived in the history of the world is this right here. Jesus Christ always leads by example, right? This is one of the things that makes Jesus such an incredible leader. Like, Jesus doesn't just read the Gospels, man. What you're gonna see is Jesus does not just tell us how we ought to live in a way that glorifies God, right? He didn't just tell us what to do, but in addition to that, Jesus actually goes first, and Jesus repeatedly shows us what it looks like to live in a way that glorifies God. He always leads by example. Another way to say it would be this, family. Like think about this. Jesus never says, "Do as I say, but not as I do." Like never at any point in this ministry is it as if, Jesus is driving a Chevy but selling a Ford, right? He doesn't lack integrity when it comes to how he leads and what he teaches at all. He's never inconsistent, man. I mean, he's unlike a lot of leaders today, political leaders, social leaders, celebrity, government leaders, unlike a lot of leaders, even church leaders, unlike a lot of leaders today, like he's not the mayor of Double Standardsville, right? It's not like Jesus is saying, hey, you need to do this, but living in a way that completely contradicts what he's saying. And I'm just telling you, family, this is one of the things that's so incredibly refreshing about Jesus. A leader that doesn't just say, here's how you should live, but actually lives in a way that sets the tone and sets the example and humbly shows us how to live. And I want you to see this, man, because it's easy to miss this. I want you to see this is exactly what we're seeing right here in verse 1. As Jesus Christ accepts this invitation to go to dinner with a man who can't stand him. You know what he's doing? He's giving us a visible picture of what it actually looks like to live a life that glorifies God. He's showing us what it looks like to obey his teaching. Here's what I mean. At some point, way back a long time ago, we were in Luke chapter 6, and it was a while ago, but there was this moment in Luke chapter 6 where Jesus was preaching a very important sermon to thousands and thousands of people. It was a massive multitude of folks, right? And Jesus is preaching this sermon to these people in Luke 6. And I don't know if you remember this or not. One of Jesus's sermon points was this right here, family. I'll read it to you. It was in Luke chapter 6, verse 27. One of his sermon points was this. Remember this? He said, but I say to you who hear, love your who? Enemies. Love your enemies. And then he says, do what? Do good to those who hate you. And that's the kicker, right? Because some of us are like, yeah, okay, love my enemies. Okay, I'll love them in my heart from like 100 miles away and never have to see them, and I can avoid them at Walmart, right? No. He doesn't just say love them in your heart. Love your enemies, Jesus says. Do good to those who hate you, meaning they're not doing good to you. They're even thinking good about you. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. Jesus says, do good to those who hate you. And just for a moment, because I know a lot of us, man, we've heard that verse who knows how many times during our lives, and we tend to become numb to stuff. But just for a second, beloved, I want you to think about how absolutely and completely countercultural that idea is. Do good to those who don't do good to you. Love your enemies. Love those who have positioned themselves as your enemies. Think about how countercultural that is. How many of y'all know we live in a fallen world that is consistently encouraging us to hate our enemies and to block our enemies and to ghost our enemies and to defriend our enemies and to cancel our enemies and to get even with our enemies. That's what the world says. And then Jesus comes along and he says, no. Don't get even. Don't block. Don't cancel. Don't defriend. Love them. Do good to those who refuse to do good to you. Do you get how counterculture this is? And then Jesus, here's what's so amazing about Jesus and his leadership. He doesn't just say that and drop the bomb and says, now good luck and go figure it out. Jesus then turns around and he goes first. Jesus turns around and he shows us what it looks like to actually love those who hate you and to do good to those who don't do good for you. When he accepts the dinner invitation to a complete toad who just wants to conspire against him and take him out. And then it doesn't even stop there, because you keep reading throughout the Gospel of Luke and the other three Gospels, and you see over and over, time and time again, where Jesus went first and he engages his enemies and draws near to his enemies and even has conversations and spends time with those who mean him harm. And then before the Gospel of Luke is over, family, Jesus is going to show us in the most dramatic way what it actually looks like to love your enemies in a way that completely blows our minds when Jesus ultimately will die on a cross for enemies. It's the whole story and narrative of the gospel, man. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us, Romans 5:8. We were enemies of God, and Jesus dies on the cross. So this is just who Jesus is. This is what Jesus does. He doesn't say, do as I say and not as I do. He says, here's what I'm saying. Now let me show you how this works. So with all that being said, here's what I want you to do right now, just real quick. Audience participation. I want you in your mind right now just to picture the face of a person that you would classify today as sort of an enemy. Just right now in your mind, just I want you to think of a person, think of their face. You know, I don't know, maybe they've done something, said something, posted something, betrayed, whatever. Maybe it's a boss, maybe it's a family member, maybe it's a friend who betrayed you, I don't know. But I want you to picture the face of someone that you today would put in the enemy bucket, right? They would be in the enemy bucket. They position this, we don't get along, there's angst, there's a rift, just picture in your mind the face of someone that you don't like. And some of you are like, well, it's not real hard to picture in my mind. It's you, Pastor. It's you. It might be. I blow it all the time. It could be. It could be. But whoever it is, just picture them in your mind. Now here's the question. If you're a follower of Jesus, and the Bible says if your faith is in Christ, guess what? You have the Holy Spirit of God living and dwelling within you that empowers you to obey the Lord. It empowers you to walk in obedience and in victory over sin. So those of you in here who know Jesus, love Jesus, your faith is in Jesus, the Holy Spirit of God lives and dwells within you. Here's my question for you as you're picturing that enemy. What is one practical thing you could do in the next couple weeks in order to actively engage that person and do good, not just think good, do good for that individual who you have been hurt by? And let's be honest, here's what happens. So think about what I just asked you to do, and here's what tends to happen. Immediately in our minds, we begin to think things like this. Well, what if I do that and that relationship doesn't get better? What if I do that and I get hurt again? Or what if I do that and nothing is fixed? I want you to think about something for a second. Again, this is now the third time Jesus has accepted a dinner invitation from a Pharisee. He said yes 3 times, and this one is going to end like the first 2 did, right? And yet Jesus still accepts these invitations. Now, here's the thing. You and I have the benefit of hindsight. We know how the story ends, and all of us who know the story, we are quite aware that things between Jesus and the Pharisees are not going to be fixed. They're not going to get better. In fact, they're going to get worse, and the Pharisees are going to keep trying to nail Jesus to a cross, and that's ultimately where this is going to lead. And so you and I know that even though Jesus is accepting invitations over and over again and spending time with these cats, nothing is going to get fixed. And yet, so what happens is our temptation would be to look at Jesus and go, what a waste of time. What a waste of time. You could have been spending time with other people, teaching other people. Why do you keep spending time with these people? Nothing's ever going to get better. Why do you keep spending time with these enemies, right? We think it's a waste of time, but Jesus continues to do it. And so some of us think to ourselves, well, it seems like a waste of time to engage an enemy if nothing's going to get better and nothing's going to be fixed, to show them love when I'm probably just going to get hurt again. But here's the question I want to propose to you today, family. As believers, do we do the right thing because it's the right thing? Or do we only do the right thing to get a specific result that we want? Let me give you this point real quick. Jot this down. Number 2. Follow this family. Put this down. Number 2. Followers of Jesus should do the right thing because it's the right thing, not just to get a specific result. When you're generous, are you generous because what Jesus said to be? And this is what it means to be a Christian, to live generously with the resources that God has blessed me with, and my time and talent and treasure. And it's just what God has said. So I'm gonna live generously because I love God and I believe God and I trust God and I'm gonna walk in obedience to God. When you're generous, are you generous because it's the right thing, or are you generous in the hopes that God will give you more stuff? When you forgive that person who has harmed you and wronged you, do you forgive them because God said forgive? Forgive as Christ has forgiven you. Let them off the hook in the same way that you've been let off the hook in the gospel. Do you forgive because Jesus said so? Or do we forgive just to try to manipulate things and try to make that relationship get better? What if it doesn't? Do we do the right thing because it's the right thing, or instead, family, do we just do it to get a specific result? Notice what Jesus is doing. Things aren't going to get better between he and the Pharisees, and yet still he accepts the invitation. Why? Because loving your enemies is the right thing to do. And so Jesus once again sets the example for us. Watch what happens next. Look at verse 1. Check this out. One Sabbath, when he went to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisee, they were watching him carefully. All right, so I want you to pay close attention to this. Notice this really important detail that Luke just gave to us. Picture in your mind what's happening here. This is narrative, right? It's narrative, so it's easy to sort of picture the scenario and see sort of in your mind's eye how events are playing out. So Jesus, we're told, get this, he walks into this room, he takes his seat at the table in this Pharisee's house, right? We'll call him Pharisee Phil. And so Pharisee Phil invites him to his home and to his dinner table. And so Jesus comes in, he sits at the dinner table, and then there's all kinds of other Pharisees there, and they're all staring at Jesus. You ever been in a situation where someone kept staring at you? It's creepy, right? Right now, I'm kind of terrified, right? It can be very uncomfortable. Jesus sees this is happening. Jesus understands every single one of these guys. Notice what we're told. They're watching Jesus carefully. They're watching Jesus carefully. Now, words matter. Here's what's so fascinating. I looked this up this past week. That word watching right there, you can look, if you have a Logos Bible program, something like that, you can look this up. That word watching right there in that verse is only used 4 other times in the entire New Testament. So it's used a total 5 times in the New Testament. And every single time that word watching is used, it always means to watch with a critical eye. Every single time. It means to spy with like nefarious intentions. You're trying to catch somebody doing something wrong. That's what it means. So in other words, get this, family, what Luke is clearly trying to get us to see is that, get this Pharisee has not invited Jesus over to his house out of the kindness of his heart just to enjoy some pizza rolls and taquitos and give him a gold star on the key to the city for raising dead people back to life. That's not what's going on here. This is not Old Testament hospitality we're seeing here. But instead, what Luke is trying to get us to all to see right here, family, is that this entire dinner is just a trap. It's a trap for Jesus. This entire thing is just a setup. They're trying to take Jesus out. They're trying to trap him. Let me ask you a question. How many of y'all in here have ever had a experience where you felt trapped? Anybody ever felt trapped? Anybody ever been trapped in traffic on 285? It's encouraging, right? Anybody ever been trapped in an airplane on the tarmac in Atlanta? Couldn't get off, right? If you flew Spirit, you did, right? I'm serious. How about this? Anybody ever been trapped? Let's talk. Anybody ever felt trapped in a conversation with a person you couldn't get out of? And like you were trying. It's like social cues, everything. It was like you couldn't escape. My wife and I have a signal, right? We have a signal. We're like, hey, if we go to this party, if we go to this thing, that's great. But if I'm trapped, you'll know because as I'm talking to this person, I'll be doing this. So come save me, right? I was trapped. Just this week, man, there was an experience where I was out of town for a couple days at a pastor's thing. And quite a few pastors there I'd never met before. And at some point, I meet this one pastor I'd never met before. And we start having a conversation. And immediately I knew it was a bad idea when he started talking to me about CrossFit. Anybody ever had a conversation with somebody who does CrossFit? You would know because it's all they talk about, right? And it's not that you care, it's just like all they want to talk about. It was incredible to me how quickly we slid into this conversation. It was stunning, man. At one minute we're talking about Jesus and the Bible and actually the Gospel of Luke and culture and doctrine and social issues. And the next minute he looks at me and goes, hey man, I'm gonna get up at 6 a.m. in the morning. You wanna get up with me? I'm gonna go do a Murph. I said, what? I don't even know what you just said, man. He's like, I'm gonna go do a Murph. I'm like, dude, what in the world is a Murph? And he's like, well, it's so, yeah. He said to me, he's like, how do you not know what a Murph is? Which that's encouraging, right? How do you not know what a Murph is? Don't you even CrossFit? I'm like, look at me, of course not, right? He's like, a Murph is a 1 mile run, and like 100 pull-ups and 200 push-ups and 300, burpees or something, and then another mile run. You wanna get up at 6 a.m. and do a Murph? I said, no. But then he just kept talking. He kept talking about CrossFit, and here's my gym, and here's what we do, and we do these kettlebell swings, and it's fun, and we do all these burpees, and he just keeps going and going and going. It's like I just pulled the string on a Chatty Cathy doll, right? Except it's not Chatty Cathy, it's CrossFit Cathy, and he just keeps going and talking and going and talking, and finally at some point I'm thinking, how do I get out of this conversation? And I'm looking around the room, trying to make eye contact with other pastors, but none of them were looking at me. They're trapped in other conversations. And so at some point, you ever done this? You're trapped, and internally you're like, it's over. I'm tapping out. And so what I did is I took a step away. Like you're still listening, but you're moving. You know what I'm saying? Anybody done this? Like you're trying to give away the social cue of we're done now. I have to go to another human, right? But he's just not taking the hint. So instead of ending the conversation, you know what he does? He just keeps following me. Yeah, you want to do some burpees? I can show you a burpee. Let's do some burpees. It's like, I was trapped. Now here's the thing about being trapped. We all know this feeling. We all know the feeling of being trapped. Like when you feel trapped, you feel powerless. When you feel trapped, you feel hopeless. And when you feel trapped, it's bewildering. It's sort of confusing. Now you got to understand these guys play here. Here's what they're trying to do. According to Luke, man, Luke is trying to show us right here that these Pharisees are sitting at this dinner table as Jesus walks in on the Sabbath day, invited to this dinner. And as he sits down, they're all watching Jesus very closely and carefully because, you know why? Because much like hunters in a deer stand, they're trying to trap him. They're trying to take Jesus out. Listen, they want to take away Jesus' influence. They want to take away Jesus' power. They want to do everything they can to discredit Jesus with the people because he's gained a massive following and they're very threatened by this. We've already read in the Gospel of Luke, they're jealous of the following Jesus as God, so they're trying to discredit him. Now, the really important question that we all have to ask at this moment is, well, then what kind of trap could this be? They're trying to trap Jesus on a Sabbath day at a dinner at the house of a Pharisee. Well, what kind of trap could this be? What are some ways that Jesus might potentially get into trouble on a Sabbath day? Well, how have we already seen Jesus get into trouble on a Sabbath day? Typically, it involves a sick person, a suffering person, and Jesus' compassion for broken people. What kind of trap could this be? Well, pay very close attention to who else just happens to be at this dinner. Look at verse 2. And behold, Jesus walks in, Jesus takes a seat at the table, and behold, there was a man before him who had dropsy. Well, my, what a coincidence. What a random occurrence, man. You got to pay attention to this. See, here's what's so crazy about all this, family. Prior to Luke chapter 14, there have already been 2 different times, two different moments where Jesus intentionally healed someone with a disease or a sickness or a disability on the Sabbath day. And the result was the Pharisees absolutely lost their ever-loving minds, right? Because how dare Jesus show kindness and mercy and miraculous healing to a person who's sick and suffering? Doesn't Jesus know that you're not supposed to work on a Sabbath? And so a controversy is stirred up because they can't believe Jesus would dare to work on a Sabbath by healing these people. Now, with all that in mind, think about what's happening right here. We have to back up and we have to see the whole progression of events, because this is crazy when we see this plot put together, right? It's a Sabbath day, and one of the Pharisees invites Jesus over to his home for dinner. Come on over for some fish and taters. And when Jesus walks in and sits down at the table, the person across from Jesus, right there near Jesus, just happens to have dropsy. So what in the world is dropsy? Well, contrary to what some people think, it's not a disease that makes you clumsy. You'll get that on the way home. Been working on that all week and nothing. We got to do some work here because in the year 2023, we don't use that lingo. Like if you went to WebMD, you could Google that and most likely not even get. It's not a word we use in our medical vernacular today. But what it is, here's what it is. We do use this word. Dropsy is edema. How many of y'all heard of edema, right? It's the modern day disease edema. And here's what edema is, man, if you're familiar with it, and some of you in the medical profession probably are, it's a terrible, horrible, painful existence, man. So apparently what happens is you begin to retain a huge amount of fluids in your body, and no matter what you do, you just continue to swell up. But the problem is you're constantly thirsty, and so you constantly are wanting something to drink, but the more you drink, the more you actually retain water and continue to swell up, which means you're always uncomfortable, suffering, you're in pain, it's excruciating. It's a miserable existence, man. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you actually believe that it just happens to be a crazy coincidence and a complete accident that when Jesus shows up at this Pharisee's house on the Sabbath day, there happens to be a man sitting near him with a disease? You think that's an accident? Of course not. You got to remember, these guys are on the prowl. These guys are hunting. These guys are trying to trap Jesus. All of this is a complete setup. It's a setup. Now, just as an aside, I want to say something really important here, okay? Just sort of as a caveat, which has nothing to do with the sermon at all, but it kind of does, okay? Just so you know, family, let me be clear about this. This right here is what legalistic religious people are always like. Beware of becoming a religious, legalistic person, because this is what legalistic religious people are always like. Legalistic people always care more about making a point than they care about making a difference. Legalistic religious people always care more about winning a debate than they care about actually winning someone to the Lord. Legalistic religious people care far more about being right than they care about living righteously. And legalistic and religious people consistently care more about what they want than they care about the needs of broken people around them. I mean, just think about this, family. Listen, how sick is this scenario? I mean, think about, like, we live in a world where man's inhumanity to man is astounding, man. And this is part of what we're seeing right here. Think about how sick this is, family. How hard-hearted and prideful, like how much compassion do you have to lack to be able to use a broken person who's suffering and in pain as a pawn in your little game? Like, how sick and twisted are these religious guys who claim to love the Bible and love God and love the purposes of God, and they're using this man as a pawn. I mean, could you imagine the sick conversation that must have happened before church that Sabbath day? Pharisees getting together, plotting, conspiring. hey, I got an idea. Let's have a dinner at Pharisee Field's house, and then we can invite Jesus. But before Jesus gets there, we can go get Dropsy Billy, and we can ask Dropsy Billy to come to the dinner too. And we can sit Dropsy Billy right across from Jesus, and we know exactly what Jesus will do when he sees Dropsy Billy, because Jesus can't help himself but to show kindness and mercy and grace to people who were suffering. And as soon as he heals Dropsy Billy, we got him. Look how sick is this scenario. So the question now becomes this: what in the world is Jesus going to do? I wonder how Jesus will respond to this trap. He knows it's a trap. How will Jesus respond to this trap? Well, watch what happens in verse 3. And just so you know, just as a setup, before we read verse 3, this is one of the things I love most about Jesus. And this is one of the things that a lot of people in church, a lot of followers of Jesus, need to learn from Jesus and actively put into practice. Watch what happens in verse 3. Check this out, family. And Jesus, what's that word? One more time, what's that word? This is a really important word. And Jesus responded. Here's what that's important. Jesus didn't ignore. Jesus didn't pretend like there wasn't a huge, massive elephant in the room. He didn't just pretend like everything was fine. Jesus responded to the lawyers and Pharisees saying, watch this, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? Listen, this is one of the things that I most appreciate and most love deeply about Jesus and the example he sets for us. I don't know if you've read the Gospels, but one of the things you'll discover when you read the Gospels is this. Here's what's amazing about Jesus. Jesus Christ is never afraid to deal with a gigantic elephant in the room. He just doesn't play games. He's never like passive aggressive. He's never like, oh, for the sake of everybody's feelings, I'll just ignore the, listen, if there's an issue, if there's a hard conversation that needs to be had, Jesus is going to lovingly step into that mug. This is what I love about Jesus. Jesus is consistently the most emotionally mature person in the room. Everywhere he goes, every crowd he's in, everyone he interacts with, Jesus is the emotionally mature. He's the adult in the room. And that's exactly what we're seeing right here, man. And this is really, really important, family, because we live in a world where so many people, even in God's church, right? Even in the Christian world, so many people are just passive aggressive when they have issues with someone else and unwilling to have an honest, loving, gentle, biblical conversation with someone that they're experiencing some strife with, right? So what we often do is we just pretend to ignore it, but then the resentment just builds up and it ultimately blows up anyway because we're sinners and we're not dealing with things biblically, right? But we pretend like everything's okay. But Jesus doesn't do this. I love this about Jesus. Jesus looks at these guys and he's like, hey, listen, you know what we're gonna do? We're gonna talk about this. We're gonna talk about this. Because I'm not 3 years old, we're not in preschool, we're adults, and so I'm gonna have the conversation nobody else in this room is willing to have. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? He just goes there. And incidentally, beloved, listen, there's actually a really important principle here, really important principle. And it's this, and it's not a point, but you can write this down if you want to. Really important principle here is this. Listen, spiritually mature people are willing to have hard conversations when they're necessary. Nobody likes having difficult conversations. Listen, I think nobody. Like if you do, there's something twisted about you. Like difficult conversations, we call them difficult because they're difficult, right? We call them hard because they're incredibly hard. Nobody enjoys stepping into that stuff. But sometimes, listen, here's what Jesus understands. There's only one path forward, and the one path forward is a hard conversation. The one path forward is to deal with this issue. Sometimes the only path forward in a relationship is to actually have a really difficult conversation that you need to have because there's an undealt with elephant in the room. And for some of you in here, man, the most spiritually significant thing you could maybe do today, this week, this month, is to draw near to that person you've got that issue with and lovingly, graciously have the hard conversation. Jesus is the adult in the room. Let's talk about this. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? I don't care how uncomfortable it makes you. We got to talk about it. Let's talk about it. Notice the powerful example he said. Now, you want to see that's what spiritually mature looks like. That's what mature looks like. Let's see what spiritually immature looks like. Look no further than verse 4. Watch what happens in verse 4. But they remained silent. You got the spiritually mature, hey, let's deal with the issue. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? And they remain silent. Well, what do you mean? There's no issue. We're fine. Come on. But they remained silent. Then watch what Jesus did. Then he took him and he healed him and he sent him where? Isn't that fascinating? Jesus sent him away. Why would you? I don't know if you noticed this. We haven't even had any chicken served yet. It's a dinner party. Dinner ain't even been served yet. Jesus heals the guy and sends him away. Why did Jesus heal the guy and then send him away? Well, because Jesus knows this guy was never a guest at the dinner anyway. He was just a pawn. Just like, tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to heal you. I'm going to free you. Then I'm going to send you away so these guys can exploit you a second longer. And I want you to see this, family. In a broken and fallen world that oftentimes exploits people, Jesus Christ doesn't exploit people. He frees people. Jesus doesn't exploit people. He loves people. Jesus Christ doesn't exploit people. He saves people. And Jesus Christ doesn't exploit people. He changes the lives of broken people. And then in addition to all that, I want you to notice this. Jesus actually invites all of us to decide. He invites all of us to decide what kind of people we're going to be. I want you to think about this. Watch what I mean. Watch what Jesus says next to these Pharisees. He's going to invite them to decide what kind of people they actually want to be. In a moment where they've been nothing but cold and hardened and arrogant and wicked. Watch what happens in verse 4. But they remained silent. And then he took him and healed him and sent him away. And Jesus said to them, which of you, having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well on a Sabbath day, will not immediately pull him out? And they could not reply to these things. All right, so listen. Okay, so we're about to end, but I want you to get this. Pay really close attention to what Jesus just did, family. Listen, even though these Pharisees are wicked and proud and religious and legalistic and they clearly care more about themselves and they care about some broken, suffering man with a disease who's retaining water and he's always in pain. Even though they have wicked hearts, man, in spite of all that, notice what's happening here. Notice, family, that Jesus still gives all of these guys an opportunity to repent. I want you to see the long suffering of Jesus here. I want you to see what Jesus is doing here. He's still patient. He's still good. And he's still giving these guys an opportunity to see their own sin. And notice how Jesus does it. He makes it personal for them. He said, hey, brother, let me ask you a question. Which one of you, your own little boy, falls into a deep hole on the Sabbath day, which one of you would not immediately save your child? So could you imagine that? Could you imagine the heart of somebody who sees his little boy fall into some deep well, right? And he watches it happen. It just happens to be the Sabbath day. And he watches his son fall in a well and then he runs over and goes, hey, Joey, sorry. I'd help you, but it's the Lord's day. Pray. Try not to do work. Be back tomorrow. Could you imagine? Just like there's not a single one of you in here who would immediately rescue your own child. Do you see what he's doing? He's trying to put their arrogance in front of them. He's trying to get them to see how wicked and evil and cold their hearts have been. Another way to say it would be this. This is a final point for today, family. Jot this down if you're taking notes. Get this, number 3. Listen, don't miss this. Don't miss this. Jesus is inviting all of us to decide what kind of people we're going to be. Jesus is inviting all of us to decide what kind of people we are going to be. When is the last time that you got alone, like, living room, shut off your devices, Netflix not a thing, your phone's shut down, your iPad's shut, and It was just you in a room, and you thought for a while about this question: what kind of person do I want to be? And one of the really dangerous things, I think, man, in our culture, in our world, in our society, even amongst church people, is self-reflection almost isn't even a thing anymore, because we're always surrounded by noise, always surrounded and inundated with voices telling us how to live and what to think and what to believe and who to vote for and all the things. And when's the last time that we actually, in silence and solitude and stillness, before the Lord, asked the question, what kind of person am I becoming? And what kind of person do I want to be? Like, in 6 months, in 4 years, on my deathbed, what kind of person do I want to have become? And where is the trajectory of my life heading right now? Like true self-reflection. See, what Jesus is doing here is really beautiful when you look at it under the surface, because what Jesus is doing, family, is he's given these guys an opportunity. It's an invitation to decide what kind of people they want to be. Like, are you going to see things the way that God sees them? Are you going to insist on your own way, your own heartless, weird way? You exploit people. You don't even care about the mission of God. You're all arrogant and prideful. Or are you going to see things the way the Lord sees them? What kind of person are you going to be? Think about this, family. Do you want to be the kind of person who shows love to the people around you who mean you ill, who mean you harm, who don't love you back? Do you going to be the kind of person, do you want to be, not are you today, but do you want to be? Do you desire and aspire to be the kind of person who seeks to love the people around you who are unjust towards you, who don't do good, who don't wish good for you? And yet, like, if you have kids, man, or if you have family, your kids and your family one day reflect on your life and said, man, what's so amazing about her, what's so amazing about him is how they loved everyone, including those who were just jerks. You want to be that kind of person? Do you want to be the kind of person who, like, when you see suffering in front of you, when you see needs in front of you, you're moved and stirred with compassion to do something, much like Jesus with the man with dropsy? You want to be the kind of person whose eyes are open to the needs in front of you. And when you see needs and spot needs, man, you don't wait for somebody else to swoop in and to try to minister to that person. But instead, man, you are moved with compassion like Jesus. You move into action. You want to meet the need. You want to give generously. You want to come alongside to show kindness and mercy to the person who's hurting. Do you want to be someone like that? Or do you want to be the kind of person who ignores and is blind to the needs around you unless they're yours? What kind of person do you want to be? Do you want to be the kind of person who honors the Lord's day and honors the Sabbath day? And clearly the Sabbath day was important to Jesus, and it was important that it be about something, and Jesus made the Sabbath day. And you know, it's interesting when you think about this, because in the culture of Jesus in the first century, their issue was this, that the Pharisees had determined nothing at all should be done on the Sabbath day. That was their issue in the first century in Israel. But it seems like in our American context in 2023, the pendulum has kind of swung way over here to the other extreme, and our philosophy has become, we can do anything we want to on the Sabbath day, even if it gets between us and the Lord, right? It's the same problem, different issue. Do you want to be different? Do you want to be the kind of person who says, this is the Lord's day, it's the Sabbath day, this is God's day, it's for him? And do you want to be the kind of person who sees sin the way that God sees sin? Listen, like, when's the last time we've actually sat in a room and self-reflected? Here's the thing, I want you to forget everything you thought you knew about church, and I want you to relearn what the church is actually supposed to be. Every single Sunday, beloved, when we gather together, every single Sunday when we hear God's word being proclaimed, you know what this is? It's much like an encounter with Jesus at a table where it's you know what Jesus is doing? It's an invitation It's an invitation for you and I to decide the kind of people we want to be. And so every single week, Jesus invites us to see the world the way that he sees the world. And every single Sunday, every single week, he invites us to see our enemies the way that he sees our enemies. And every single week, he invites us to see the suffering around us the way that he sees the suffering around us. And he invites us to see the Sabbath day the way that he does. And he invites us to see our sin the way that he does. Every single week, this moment is an invitation for us to decide, what kind of person do I want to be? We get one life. The book of Hebrews says it this way: it is appointed for a person to die once, and then comes judgment. We get one shot at this thing. What kind of person are you going to be? What kind of person am I going to be? And the reality is that there are two different options, probably more than two, but at least two, and the two are this. There's the option where the trajectory of our lives could turn us into people like these Pharisees. Cold, selfish, prideful, arrogant, lacking compassion, but convinced that we're the godliest people in the room. Or we can become people like, honestly, frankly, this broken man with dropsy. You know what's amazing about the man with dropsy? Listen, I guarantee you, man, if there was anybody in that room who understood that he needed Jesus, it was this man. He needs the mercy of Jesus. He needs the love of Jesus. He needs the compassion of Jesus. He needs the truth of Jesus and the life of Jesus. What kind of people are we going to be? By God's grace, would we be people who desire to just be more like Jesus? Let's pray together, family. We're going to pray. We're going to spend time at the Lord's table. We're going to take communion together. If you're in here today and you know Jesus and you love Jesus and your faith is in Jesus, you've turned from your sin and trusted in Jesus Christ alone as your great God and Savior, we want to invite you, Christian, part of the family of God, to one of these tables around the room to partake in the elements of communion. The bread's laid out as it is every single week. With the cup, we take it. We take the bread, represents the body of Jesus nailed to the cross for our sin. We dip it in the cup, representing his blood shed out for the forgiveness of our sins. We take it, we eat it. Remember his mercy, remember his love, remember his compassion. We thank him for who he is, for all he's done. And we ask him to help us to be the people that he desires for us to be in a world that constantly surrounds us with noise and lies.